this continent, and the Central Coast where I'm sitting is the lands of the Gadigal. I've been in Sydney too long. The Guringai, Awabakal and Darkinjung peoples. This land was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I also pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people attending tonight. And Aboriginal people lived on this land for tens of thousands of years in what we now know to have been a sustainable economy. And the more information that we get from history and from wonderful, beautiful books like Darkinjung, the more we know that to be true. And I often reflect on that point because our notion of an economy has become so synonymous with the current economy that we are in right now. And this, this economic status quo that most of us were born into and have spent our whole lives in. So it's difficult to see something different. But we've forgotten then that, an economy is designed by people, and so it can be changed by people. And at the end of the day, it's about shifting and distributing power in different ways. And the economy that we're living in is one of many, many different possibilities. And we shouldn't be afraid to dream of something much better than what we have now. And one of the problems of not of buying the economic status quo and the mainstream myths of this is kind of how it is, as though economics is some kind of science, makes us forget that we can actually reimagine the way that we live our lives. And so it would be a massive understatement to say that that 2020 has really truly sucked. There's been a huge amount to get frustrated about this year, and across the globe there's lots to grieve for as well. And I know that we have many things to worry about as we head into the next year. But in amongst everything that we've been experiencing, we've discovered how adaptable human beings are. And I think we knew that, but we don't like change. But it seems that we can change our way of living quite radically when we have to, and quite quickly, really. And even finding that some of those changes that we're forced to make are actually for the better. And that gives us hope. Well, it certainly gives me hope. Hope that people will more readily accept the changes needed to address the other crises that we face, such as the ongoing crisis of economic inequality, as well as that ever-present crisis of climate change. So, I'm not the first to say that there's, that COVID has shown us that we can actually do a lot of the things that we were told we couldn't do when we were trying to address climate change. COVID-19 and the global economic fallout from that has also exposed the major flaws in our economic system. And it's led more people to question the core of mainstream economic thinking. And for decades, we've been subject to this onslaught of neoliberal ideology and government policy that's been designed to con us into believing that we have to outsource essential public services to corporations, that giving more money to big business and wealthy individuals is justified on the basis that it somehow trickles down to the rest of us. And we've been socialized, and this is really important to think about the way it's changed the way we think, because neoliberalism has socialized us to think of ourselves as individuals, and divided into, the so-called lifters and leaners, with each person being responsible for their own fate. But now people are finding that, this kind of late stage capitalism doesn't work all that well in responding to a crisis. Who would have thought? It turns out that running down our public sector, for instance, doesn't make for a very resilient society. And all that angst about surpluses and budgets can just get thrown out of the window when it comes to the crunch. It turns out that we can afford things when we need to, or at least when governments decide that they want to. And more people have seen that now, as well as more people having learnt just how easily their fortunes can change through no fault of their own. And so a space has opened up where we can more easily discuss changing our economic status quo and moving to an economic system that focuses not on profit and growth, but on well-being and sustainability. And at the heart of that new sustainable and resilient economy must be the premise that everyone deserves what they need to live a good life. And in a well-functioning, productive, modern economy, the starting point must be that every person has enough food, shelter, clothing, medicine, electricity, and the means to get around before anyone else can be wealthy. And any economy that has people in poverty while others are billionaires is not an economy worth having. And I have said that in New South Wales Parliament and been laughed at, and been chastised and had my, people rolled their eyes at me. But I think it's a really important thing to remember. If you've got an economy where 13% of our population were actually living in poverty before the coronavirus hit, while we have 40 billionaires and over 1 million millionaires in this country, a society with that much wealth inequality is not the product of a well-functioning, well-designed and productive modern economy. It's the exact opposite. And the fact that our politicians don't consider that to be bad economic management is really telling. And so the New South Wales government, for example, is guided not by the goal of eliminating poverty or by ensuring any minimum level of living standards. Their legislated goal in New South Wales, actually in the legislation, is that this government, when running the state's finances, its number one goal, in fact, its only goal, is to maintain the AAA credit rating of the state, to limit the cost of government borrowing, to enable access, this is a quote, to enable access to the broadest possible investor base for government borrowing, and to, quote, maintain business and consumer confidence. People aren't mentioned, only consumers. And the state government sees itself as though it's running some sort of business for corporate shareholders. And, it's really gross because there's no mention of reducing economic inequality or even of ensuring efficient spending. Let alone managing the state economy in a way that will increase levels of well-being. And so that's a prime example of just how absurd mainstream economics has become, even more so in times of crisis. But we can have an economy that is fit for purpose. And in my view, it begins with a universal basic income. And there are loads of different UBI models around. They vary in detail, rationale, intended outcomes, and some can be really quite conservative. The most conservative version of a UBI is something that tries to substitute government responsibility for a market-based user-pay system of social services, for example. So where the government gives you a certain amount of money and you have to go and spend it on your essential services and the government doesn't provide anything else. Obviously, that's not the kind of UBI that the Greens would support or that I would be here talking about today. So in proposing our own Greens New South Wales version of a UBI and calling it a Universal Wellbeing Payment, we're showing our support for other progressive models of UBI. But really importantly, we get to set out what we view as being the best version of a universal basic income. Our starting point is at the very extreme. It's at the utopian side of things, which I'm not afraid of being called utopian or having some sort of utopian view, because and although it is what I would think of as the best version of a universal basic income, it is still achievable, and we'll come to that. But secondly, the reason that we designed a specific UBI for the Greens New South Wales to campaign on was to give people sufficient detail so that they could see what it would mean for them in practice. So that it wasn't just a theory, it was something that had a lot of detail around it. So the language we use for things can either reinforce mainstream economic thinking or it can turn it on its head. And it really does matter. And it's critical to why we called our version of a UBI a universal wellbeing payment. So the universal wellbeing payment is universal in that everybody over the age of 16 receives it. It has no conditions, no means testing. Along with universal healthcare, universal education, and universal housing, the universal wellbeing payment would be a core part of our societal structure under a progressive economy. No one should have to beg the government for the support they need in tough times. We shouldn't be forced to wait, to jump through hoops to meet conditions, or to repeatedly justify our circumstances to the likes of Centrelink. And imagine how much easier people would have found it, as well as government, in planning their response during this pandemic if they already had a universal wellbeing payment coming in, instead of having to wait to be noticed by the government as they fall through the gaps in our welfare system. There's nothing basic about the universal wellbeing payment. It's not an amount to ensure that you just survive. It's an amount to ensure that you thrive. It's not an amount that still forces you to take on paid work before you can do more than just get by from day to day. It's an amount that recognises the contributions that we all make to our society, and that recognises the right of all of us to a minimum standard of well-being, regardless of whether or not we also have paid work. And so we've started it at $550 a week, but there is a mechanism in our design for that to go up or down depending on what the cost of living happens to be. And the UWP is a payment. It's not income. It's not something you have to do something for. It's an amount you're owed simply for being a participant in our society, to spend however you like, because we all contribute in different ways, and our ability to find paid work is not synonymous with our value as individuals. Our right to well-being is separate and distinct from our right to work. And so I do support a jobs guarantee running alongside a universal basic income, and I'd be willing to have a good old chat about that. You know, ideally, the universal wellbeing payment would be implemented nationwide, but we believe it can happen at a state level. And I will finish up, because I think Sylvia's going to tell me that my time is running out, by saying that, you know, we are a relatively low taxing nation, and implementing a national UWP would require us to raise our tax revenue to the level of somewhere like New Zealand or the UK, which is still very low taxing jurisdictions globally. And I was delighted to see the research that Ben Spies-Butcher, Troy Henderson and Ben Phillips put out just this week, which also sort of backs up, because, you know, I'm not an economist or a researcher, but they are, but it backs up the assertion that I'd made previously, that, you know, we'd be looking at an extra 6 to 7% in taxation, which, as I say, would make us still a very low taxing jurisdiction. So I am running out of time. We've got a very detailed campaign. Please do have a look at universalwellbeingpayment.com.au for all of the details. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Helena and to the rest of the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. It's always difficult to know. I didn't want to cut off your flow because it was very interesting, but I know people have an opportunity at the end if you want to ask any more specific campaigns questions around the philosophy or practical ways to get involved, or anything else about the Greens New South Wales policy. There'll definitely be time for that. But I'm keen for us to hear from Helena Norberg-Hodge, who's coming from Byron Bay, where she's based. So Helena works for Local Futures, but I might let her describe the work that NGO does, and about her publications about economic justice and well-being, and linked to the environment as well. So over to you, Helena.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I started Local Futures under a different name about 40 years ago. And it was at that point an organization that was working hands-on in a remote part of the Himalayas, Western Tibet, Ladakh it's called. It is a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And from that work fairly early on, I and my team were also invited to Bhutan, and over a 5-year period witnessed changes in these two regions brought about by so-called development and economic growth. So from the 70s, I've been questioning the dominant development model and the dominant growth model. And my perspective will probably seem a bit too remote, a bit too global. It's hard to persuade people that we need to look globally to understand why things are going so very wrong worldwide. And I also want to say that I'm from Sweden originally, but I studied also in Germany, I lived in France, I had become a linguist, I spoke about 7 languages. And from that global experience, as I say, I was questioning the direction of the global economy from the 70s onward. And I'm hoping that people are willing to take this journey to sort of look beyond the confines of Australia, to try to see that, you know, what we're saying, and an increasing number of people, is that this global economic system has been exerting extremely negative pressures worldwide. And that from our point of view, we have to understand that it started with force. The economic system we have could not be what it is today if it hadn't started with slavery, colonialism, and genocide. As it happens, the men who started it, and they were at that time mainly white men, they also were very overtly misogynist and anti-nature. The worldview that was the foundation is pretty hideous. However, those foundations, those economic foundations, which then led to a splitting up of the world, so that you had a very convenient system whereby global players, global traders could do so very well. Because on one side of the world, through force and enslavement, you had people who at first were working for nothing and later on for very little. The key is to recognize that as the colonies left, people were not actually liberated. By that time, an economic system based on so-called cheap fossil fuels had imprisoned people in a debt system. So there was a system that maintained the inequality, that was a perfect setup for the elites. So in India as well, and many African countries, you had an elite that benefited enormously from keeping their labor force very cheap and globally, on the market competitive, so that you then had the system where you could produce, where people were earning maybe $1 a day, and you were selling where people were earning maybe $100 an hour. Perfect setup for global trade. And what I would like us to think about is that we have systematically handed over too much power to global traders. Now, what I'm saying is not very popular with global banks and corporations, which is also why it has been extremely difficult in the last 30 years to get anywhere into the media. We have also been shadow banned by Facebook, even though our message is not about how evil and nasty all these people are who work in corporations. We also specifically want to spare every white man from believing that they are responsible for this system. Yes, it was white men in the beginning. There was genocide. There was, this overt rape of cultures and lands. But there's been a cultural turning. And so from what we're looking at, we're seeing an economic trajectory which fundamentally, structurally, has been a travesty, has been anti-nature and anti the diversity that is a fundamental principle, an absolute essential cornerstone of life. This system that started in slavery has continued in a trajectory that has essentially remained the same, and it has led to top-down global structures that have more and more power over local, regional, and national bodies of governance and cultures. Monocultural pressure that is structural and almost inevitable if we continue on that path. On the other hand, there's been a cultural turning, which we have seen in every country. We see it now also in India and China, where people who were pushed off the land into ever larger mega urban structures, sometimes suburbanized sprawls, but pushed away from any deep relationship with the land and any real agency over their own lives, more and more dependent on vast anonymous institutions. And in a sense, the suburb is the most deadly of all, because you have people living, right next to each other and with a bit of land around them, but they have no connection to that land. They have no connection to each other. What we have been talking about is that there's a cultural turning where people show, once they have been removed from the land, removed from genuine interdependence in community, they develop a hunger for connection, reconnection with nature, reconnection with others. What they're longing for is the fabric that made us human. We evolved in intergenerational communities, deeply connected to the rest of life, to the animals, to the plants, to the water that we depended on. And this took the place of human scale interdependence. It took the form of structures that people had a certain agency over. It took the form, very importantly, of small-scale economic structures that had to be, by virtue of their size and intimacy that people had with the nature and people they depended on, it led to greater humility in the face of infinite complexity. The living world is a constantly changing, infinitely rich life, that as we were life-based, community and nature-based, we were constantly reminded of our limits of both of understanding and of control. My experience in different cultures at different levels of industrialization had convinced me that if we want to survive, we need to support as soon as possible the rebuilding of the fabric, the local fabric of more community-based, more nature-based economies. We need to come back to the decentralization that virtually every environmentalist was lobbying for when I started in the 70s. From Rachel Carson came a strong message about the blindness of science that at that time already assumed that we can treat the natural world like a machine and that we can put a little bit of poison over here and that's fine. But there was a huge wake-up call to the interconnectedness, led to a demand for more holistic, interdisciplinary knowledge and a demand for decentralization or localization. This demand was strong throughout the industrialized world. However, I ended up a passionate environmentalist from having seen these changes in Ladakh and Bhutan, where I saw almost overnight the creation of poverty, which had simply not existed. There had not been hunger, and been anything like the slums that we see, even within America and Australia, or India, of course. No hunger. I experienced the happiest people I had ever encountered, spoke the language fluently, and came to realize that I was also experiencing the deepest level of profound self-esteem and a secure identity that didn't need to prove itself. People weren't in this fearful way trying to prove that they were important and trying to prove that they could create, enormous structures and be great and big. There was the psychological security that comes from that deep connected fabric of the intergenerational community and connection to the land was dramatic. And then to see within a few years how the dominant monoculture, the consumer monoculture, created almost overnight a loss of self-esteem, and in young people, an insecurity that was completely linked to the creation of greed, in turn supported by a type of education and schooling that robbed them of ecological knowledge and pushed them into the city in search of the job as an engineer, as an agricultural expert, all of it linked to globalized, fossil fuel-based industrial production. And what was happening to agriculture was that thanks to all those cheap fossil fuels, we needed fewer and fewer people. Industrial agriculture has never ever produced more food per unit of land and water than diversified small-scale systems can do. Never. The efficiency was that it destroyed jobs while creating pollution. I really hope the Greens will be willing to look at that bigger picture, not to demand, overnight that we're suddenly going to go back to living this decentralized life. But I think there is a way that we can understand better why every crisis we face today, from the pandemic to climate change to an epidemic of depression, which by the way is global. I work a lot in Japan and Korea. It is, and my native country of Sweden, countries like Ladakh and Bhutan, where suicide didn't exist, now about 1 a month, young people. We're facing crises, all of them linked to the economic system, if we're willing to look at the big picture. Looking at the big picture doesn't mean that we suddenly decide to change everything. However, I would differ a little bit with what you were saying, Abigail. I loved what you're saying, and I'm basically supportive. But I think that what's happening is that people are missing out on the fundamental importance of rebuilding the local, more human scale, more decentralized structures as a path that is not only potentially beneficial almost overnight, but a path that builds the foundations that we encourage at the same time people keep an eye on the big picture and create a stronger political voice, a political voice that will in fundamental ways demand a decentralized approach. After COVID, the big fork in the road is, do we now keep moving the way that our governments, and I do not know of a single national government that is not going in the direction that deregulated capital and deregulated corporations want us to go. Most frightening of all is the convergence of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. We do not need to leap into 5G and faster. That is what COVID can push us into. We're spending more and more time on the screen. We would all like to have, our Zoom call today working better. We don't need to go faster, and if we do, it will benefit the giants much more than us. Let's use the technologies that we have. Let's ask for a moratorium, both on further deregulation of trade and finance. We've got to keep our eye on that, and let's do everything we can to learn from the worldwide localization movement, which is demonstrating that when you build local food economies, you can almost overnight create market pressures that push for diversification. Please don't fall for the language of carbon and regen agriculture. It comes from global corporations who are now proudly boasting of being carbon friendly and practicing regen agriculture. The key words are diversity and shorter distances. The distances are absolutely insane. We are routinely importing and exporting the same product. Oranges out, oranges in, wheat out, wheat in, beef out, over thousands of miles. The plastic nightmare we face is a nightmare because global corporations gain more wealth, extract more wealth when we become dependent on global trade. If tomorrow everyone in Australia and around the world ate food, their basic food stuff from their own country, no multinational would make money. We are not in any way demonizing the people in multinationals. We do not agree with this idea that everyone in power is a psychopath. We certainly see, the young men on Wall Street getting pretty carried away with their egos and their cocaine and so on, but it's a different story.
Helena,
Yeah,
I'd like you to, this is a good moment, I think, to, if that's all right, to just to give us the final point, because I think we would love to have some discussion with you actively about this. So much in that. There's some interesting comments coming up in the discussion.
So I think the key for us, the key is to move away from the politics of identity. This is not about individual players. It's not about individual values. For us, the key is to look at structures, to see scale and speed as the enemy of where we want to go now. We need to be supporting and nurturing a more feminine turn towards a slowing down, a reconnection and revitalization of those feminine instincts towards nurturing and care. And we need that in every profession, whether it's in farming, that there should be the time to actually care for and know the plants and the soil, in medicine and education. We need, on a crowded planet, to reverse subsidies and regulations, which have now, I don't even know how to turn this thing off. That was when I thought I had a bigger picture. I think to have much greater clarity about which path we know that most people would support. We're talking about secure livelihoods. We're talking about community. We're talking about the type of connection that we long for, because that's how we became human. That's how we evolved. This thing that we're living in now is a tiny bleep. It's just a bleep. It's like a second out of a 24-hour human evolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. No, that's wonderful. So I'd like us to have, we've had one question. Most of them are comments on the chat. And we were hoping at the end of the discussion to be able to have a bit more free-flowing discussion, which I think we might be able to do.